boa tarde a todos. Neste momento teremos o prazer de ouvir a palestra, participar da palestra de tema A Ética Assistencial pela Lente do Sofrimento Moral, proferida pela professora Kristen Jones-Bonofiglio, desculpa, é difícil o nome, diretora e professora associada da Escola de Enfermagem, diretora do Centro de Ética em Cuidados de Saúde e chefe da Unidade de Cátedra Internacional de Bioética, da Universidade de Lakehead, no Canadá. A professora Kristen enviou a gravação de sua palestra, que passaremos a transmitir a partir de agora. Ao final, ela estará presente na sala para responder às perguntas da plateia. Muito obrigada pela presença de todos. Tenham uma boa palestra, é uma palestra bastante reflexiva, como tem sido todas as outras do nosso evento. Aproveitem bastante.
Good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde. My pleasure to be here with you today, and a special thanks to your graduate program coordinator, Professor Dr. Isabel Santos, for her kind invitation to provide a presentation. I understand that the theme of the seminary is the care of yourself, the other, and the world in the context of health and humanitarian crisis. This fits very well with what I've written about in my book, Healthcare Ethics Through the Lens of Moral Distress. As is the tradition in my country, here in Canada, I wish to acknowledge the original custodians of this land and pay respect to the elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Indigenous people. I recognize that I am speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. I also acknowledge relationships with other Indigenous and Métis people who have a history in this territory. Thunder Bay, where I'm speaking to you from today, is located on the shores of the Great Lake called Lake Superior, and it is very much north of all major cities in Ontario. It has a population of about 110,000 people. We are the social and healthcare hub for many smaller, rural, and remote First Nations Indigenous communities. As you can see from the picture of my backyard, we're just getting started with the season of winter here, and it will last until about April. Now, today we're going to talk about a number of things in the realm of ethical issues. And many of these I've identified as having trends in our contemporary healthcare and ethical issues sphere. So I want to encourage you that ethics, in some respects, is about perspective. So the perspective of whether we see the glass half empty or half full. And what you will hear a lot of, and you're probably very aware of in your nursing career, is this sense of an ideology of scarcity, the fear of not having enough. So these are just a few things that I'd like to bring to your attention. So we hear all the time in the media, not enough time, not enough money and resources, power differentials, issues with relationships, and issues concerning safety. Now, when we think about time, so we hear a lot about not having enough time to provide quality patient care, feeling unable to support our colleagues because we have so much of our own work to do, not having time to listen, not having time for good communication with anyone, or maybe not enough time for thorough documentation. All of these are key issues, but we've never had any more or any less time, 24 hours in a day. So thinking about how we spend our time is part of the ethics of our practice. Money and resources. Now, this is really important when we think about the fact that budgets are on everybody's mind. COVID has very much put many different systems into crisis in terms of financial pieces, and recognizing that if we continue the way that we do, we probably are going to run short. So money and resources. So certainly in the spheres that I work in, we talk about health human resources and the resource of healthcare workers and recognizing how valuable that resource is. However, it's workers plus many other things that we must consider as resources. So whether that's hospital beds, whether that's access to medicine. In COVID, we talked about an access to ventilators, access to different treatments and perhaps diagnostic tools, many different resources. And we hear this ideology of scarcity very often. Doesn't matter what article we look at, maybe on our phone, or we see on the internet, or we see on the news. Now, the issue of power. So very often when we're talking about ethical issues, we're talking about a sense of feeling powerless, whether that's real powerlessness or perceived sense of powerlessness. We recognize that there are many hierarchies in healthcare. Sometimes we recognize a lack of leadership or a lack of management support and understanding. Often there are policies that actually conflict with our actual care practices and get in the way of us doing the things that we feel are morally just. And we also recognize the power differentials between part-time or casual employees and full-time employees. Relationships, and also in the School of Nursing that I teach at Lakehead University, we talk about relational practice. So in nursing, relationships aren't just with patients and families, although those are very important relationships. We also have relationships between doctors and nurses, other members of the healthcare team, between nurses, leadership and management, lots of different relationships on lots of different levels. And we recognize that sometimes poor or different understandings of situations can lead to issues understanding how we can achieve quality patient care and good outcomes. And even though we should be able to find shared goals and common purposes, we also recognize that there are many relational issues in healthcare, such as bullying, lateral and horizontal violence, and passive and aggressive acts. And last but not least, safety. Safety is incredibly important when we think about workplaces where people can experience satisfaction, thrive, and flourish in their work. Safety has to be there first. So certainly we recognize staffing and workload issues that can lead to safety risks, legal and professional license risks based on certain behaviors or certain practices, or even a medical error. Certainly being forced to work understaffed or stepping outside one's scope of practice, other providers' incompetencies. And we certainly are going to talk about here today how work overload can lead to things like burnout, compassion fatigue, injury and illness, absenteeism and presenteeism, substance use and addiction, and even mental health issues and suicide. So these are the trends that I've seen over the years in healthcare that really do contribute to the ethical issues that we're most often seeing in practice. So I raise these up front to get you thinking a little bit about the ethical issues that you are aware of. And I always like to start presentations with acknowledging my social location, so you can have a sense of where I'm coming from when I share with you my thoughts and ideas. And the more time that I spend as a nurse, the more that I wonder about, and the more that I realize that there's so much to learn. And in fact, there are so many lessons we keep learning over and over because we're not learning from our mistakes. And there are often missed opportunities for us to better understand each other. So for example, to ask people where they come from, why they have a certain perspective. And so with those questions in mind, I want to share with you a bit about myself so that you might understand some of the foundational aspects of me as a person that have led me to these understandings and beliefs that I'm going to share with you here today. So I'm a mother, I'm a stepmother, I'm a wife, I'm a grandmother. My husband's family is Italian, so that makes me a Nona. My family's roots are from Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and the Ukraine. I consider myself to be a leader. I'm a qualitative researcher, a writer, and a storyteller. I've worked full-time in academia for the past 14 years. And before that, I nursed in acute care on a medical unit and also in a correctional setting at a medium security men's prison and a maximum security youth detention center. I became interested in healthcare ethics when I was a student in my undergraduate nursing program. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think we only had about one lecture on ethics during the whole nursing program that I was in. That was a few years ago now. Then in 2006, I decided to take a master's degree. So I took a master's in public health. And my co-supervisor was the founding director of a center called the Center for Healthcare Ethics. His name was Dr. Yaro Kodlik. And he suggested that I might look at the idea of moral distress for my master's research. I said, sure, why not? But in fact, I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't know what moral distress was. So I went on to do a literature review and to study experiences of moral distress across all of Northern Ontario, so both East and West. And I sent surveys out to nurses and social workers who were working in community healthcare settings, because there was some research done already in acute care. So I really wanted to look at the community. Now, I used a paper questionnaire approach and they mailed it back to me. Yes, I'm that old. We did not use email at that time, at least not very frequently like we do now. So we used a paper survey with an envelope and a stamp. And what was really incredible about my master's thesis was not how the participants circled their responses to questions on a Likert scale. So 0 was no moral distress and 5 was extreme moral distress. But what was amazing was the very last question on the survey. And that question was, do you have anything further to share? And the participants in the study printed their stories on every last square inch of the survey paper. They wrote up the sides. They wrote arrows to the back of the page. They wrote tinier and tinier until they ran out of room because I only left space for a few lines, not realizing that nurses and social workers had many stories to share about moral distress. And it was through their brave stories, written by these healthcare providers who were trusting a stranger because they didn't know me as the researcher, that I first learned about moral distress, about everyday ethics in healthcare practice, and about why it really matters. And from that moment, I was hooked on learning more about moral distress. And in fact, their stories rang true with my own stories from nursing practice. And I realized that I too had experienced moral distress. I just didn't know there was a name for it. So I went on to take a PhD, and I did research using narrative inquiry. I did phone interviews with nurses across Canada, again in various community care settings, because there wasn't a lot of research in that area. And I wanted to learn more about moral distress and how education and educational interventions might help to address some of the ethical issues and experiences in practice. And it was out of my graduate research experiences and ongoing interest in moral distress that I came to write my book. And now my life has actually come full circle. So I started out with an interest in ethics as a nursing student at Lakehead University. And just over 20 years later, I'm the director and associate professor at that same School of Nursing, and I'm the director of the Center for Healthcare Ethics. So you never know where your interests may take you. And I always say that research is me search. So I would encourage you, when you're reading researchers' articles, do a quick Google search learn a little bit about those researchers, and think about their social location and where they might be coming from in the work that they do. And if you're going to be a researcher, if you are a researcher, think about the impact of your social location on the work that you do. So in my research on moral distress, I've come to take a socio-ecological approach. And that's a fancy way of saying that I take a perspective that involves layers or ideas that are nested into each other. And this helps us to consider and define different contexts. So different contexts could include the patient and family, what's happening intrapersonally for me as a healthcare provider, what's happening interpersonally between myself and another healthcare provider or team member, maybe on my unit, maybe in the organization. I also look at the healthcare system and related politics. Of course, with COVID, we now look at the context on a global level, where maybe we didn't always look at that before. And this is not the end. In fact, we have the digi-layer, so social media, the internet, electronic health records, virtual healthcare spaces, technology, text messages, avatars, and yes, even robots in our healthcare system. And then we also have a layer that I call time. So we do need to consider past, present, and future. So if you think about ethics in the context of all these layers, you can start to understand why ethics is quite complicated and why healthcare providers may struggle with ethical issues in practice and have such a variety of moral distress experiences. Now, there's a Canadian Indigenous writer known as Richard Wagamese. Richard Wagamese wrote that nothing in nature grows from the outside in. So I put this picture of a tree cut in half for you to think about something growing and how things grow and how they develop. So it's not from the outside in that things develop. Rather, everything starts to grow from the inside and then grows outward. So it is always important to consider where we came from, where we are now, and where we think we are going. It's important to start within when we want to create meaningful change. Now, my perspective on crisis, because one of the components of your theme for this seminary is this idea of crisis, both in healthcare and in terms of a humanitarian crisis. Now, there's this beautiful quote, here it's attributed to JFK, that the Chinese word for crisis is composed of two characters, one meaning danger and one meaning opportunity. So whenever we're faced with a crisis, whether it's a personal crisis, a professional crisis, or a global crisis, I think it's important for us to think about the fact that, yes, there may be danger that we need to be mindful of and need to address, but there may be an incredible opportunity that we need to pay attention to. Some other thoughts that I thought I might share with you before we talk about some of the particulars around moral distress and related concepts are my perspectives on ethics and ethical decision-making. And you'll see these concepts bubble up with the rest of my presentation. So I thought I would talk about them a little bit now. So the first piece of understanding my perspective, and perhaps a perspective that might interest you, is that my take on ethics comes from a public health lens. So my master's is in public health. So I'm always looking not only of ways of addressing a problem or an ethical issue, but what do I need to promote? What do I need to prevent? And how can I protect the things that are most valuable? I also come and approach ethical issues with harm reduction strategies in mind. In terms of addressing an ethical issue, we need to have some actions right here and right now. We also need to have some long-term goals in mind, because we can be too short-sighted if we're just putting out fires all the time. We also need to consider that all behavior has meaning. And so when we see concerning behaviors, we see behaviors that are responsive or people that are acting out of character, we need to consider what are they trying to cope with, and to think about what some of the underlying issues might be. What are some of those contextual factors? We also need to recognize that coping occurs on a spectrum to meet an individual's need. And people can have very negative coping mechanisms. They can have very positive coping mechanisms. And hopefully people have quite a range of coping mechanisms that they can draw on, depending on what the situation might be. And we also need to remember to always identify both the risks and the benefits of situations that we face. Lastly, part of my perspective is a trauma and violence informed approach. And with this type of philosophy and approach to care and approach to ethics, it's important to prioritize the following. So safety, building trust, focusing on empowerment and recognizing power and power differentials, choices, and also collaborative partnerships. Now, I think all of these things, they're not specific to public health, harm reduction, or trauma and violence-informed care. These are things that are important to quality nursing practice. And that's why they really stand out to me. And I really do try to make them part of the ethics of my practice every day. Okay, so let's discuss moral distress. And some of you may have heard of this concept before, and to others it might be new. So let's start from the ground up, or the inside out, building our understanding of moral distress. So the term itself was first written about by a man by the name of Andrew Jameson. He's an American philosopher, and he recognized this phenomena in nursing students. So he wrote about it, and we've been writing about it and learning about it ever since, for over 40 years now. And Dr. Andrew Jameson said that moral distress is when a nurse knows what to do, but can't carry it out. He also said that the reason the nurse can't carry it out is due to organizational barriers. But now we recognize that there are many other types of barriers, as well as organizational barriers. The other thing that we recognize, expanding on Dr. Jameson's original definition, is that the nurse doesn't always know what to do. Sometimes we know that we need to do something differently. Sometimes we're not sure what to do, and that could be called moral uncertainty, and that could be very difficult as well. The definition of moral distress is really expanded over time, and I think that's important, that, you know, it's a lot more inclusive. It recognizes that the nurse doesn't always know what to do. It also recognizes that moral distress goes beyond nursing. Physicians, social workers, paramedics, fire, police officers, many different professions can experience moral distress. And we also recognize that the barriers are quite diverse as well. It can get in the way of us doing what we think we need to do to provide the kind of care we want to give. One thing that we can agree on is that moral distress is caused by an ethical issue or a dilemma, but it's not the same for everyone. So someone can experience an ethical issue and not experience moral distress, where another person could experience that same ethical issue and in fact have a moral distress experience. So it's very much an individual response to a circumstance. And the symptoms of moral distress are varied and diverse as well. So we can see physical, emotional, mental, social, spiritual, and even behavioral responses to moral distress experiences. And we also find, when I say we, I'm talking about researchers and the literature on moral distress, talk a lot about moral distress building up. So if we don't work through it, if we don't talk about it, if we don't have strategies to cope with moral distress, we can develop this concept called moral residue, where that moral distress experience, each time we have it, it builds up over time. And so we can have a more intense reaction every time it happens again and again. And so you can imagine this has an incredible impact on the satisfaction that healthcare providers and different professions can have in the work that they do. And we know that there is not a very strong border between our professional lives and our personal lives. So the moral distress that we experience at work can impact us beyond the workplace. Another term that we often hear with moral distress is compassion fatigue. Now, the first time this was written about was by an emergency room nurse named Carla Joinson, and she talked about compassion fatigue. And she talked about it in the context of a lack of ability to nurture. She wrote about it in the 90s. But more commonly, compassion fatigue is connected with an American psychologist by the name of Charles Begley. He wrote about it quite a bit. And he talked about specific symptoms like chronic fatigue, people feeling irritable, feeling like they have a sense of dread about going to work, that their aches and pains and their physical ailments seem to be much stronger, and that they really had a lack of joy in everything that they did. And some of the more recent literature talks about, maybe we've named this incorrectly, because humans don't really run out of compassion. What they run out of is empathy. And empathy is that ability to really put yourself in someone else's shoes and feel what they're feeling. And that empathy is a wonderful thing if what you're feeling with someone else is a positive emotion like joy or happiness or elation. But if what you're connected to for the majority of the time is about pain and suffering, empathy without compassion can be very draining. So this idea that maybe what we've been calling compassion fatigue for many decades is actually empathy fatigue is coming through in the literature right now. And some of you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between empathy and compassion? Aren't they the same thing? Well, here's the thing. Empathy, that ability to put yourself into somebody else's shoes and feel what they're feeling, is a component of compassion. Compassion is actually two things together. It's empathy plus the desire to act. And that desire to act and that ability to act makes compassion a renewable resource. It energizes us when we feel the need to help somebody and we act on that. But empathy by itself can be incredibly draining. So this idea of empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue, it's an important concept, and it fits into the context of what we're talking about in terms of these ethical issues in practice, experiencing moral distress, and feeling compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, where an individual really feels drained by the work that they do. And of course, the opposite of that, because I always think it's important to think about the spectrum of experiences, would be compassion satisfaction. And there's some really beautiful literature on this idea of compassion satisfaction and really enjoying the work of being a helper, enjoying the work of giving to others, that altruistic experience that so many of us, that's the reason why we came into nursing. That's why we came into healthcare, because we really wanted to make a difference. Now, another related term that I'm sure you're familiar with, burnout. Now, we hear this so much in Canada. It is always in the news. Everybody's burned out after COVID. But we used to talk about it in the context of healthcare providers a bit more specifically. So really good work done on this by an American social psychologist by the name of Dr. Cristina Maslick. And Dr. Maslick has a burnout inventory scale that you might be familiar with. And Dr. Maslick talked about burnout very specifically as occupational burnout, that being a prolonged response to chronic stressors from the job that you are required to be fully engaged in. So this is not burnout to life in general, like we so often hear about it in the media right now. This is very specific to occupation. And we can recognize burnout. It has very similar symptoms to compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue. And in fact, the two can occur simultaneously. But burnout is identified by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization behaviors, and low levels of personal accomplishment. And this is so interesting. Burnout occurs in 4 stages. And the first stage is really unexpected. The first stage is actually being really enthusiastic about the work that you're doing. And then the next stage is a stagnation, not being able to move forward, not being able to act, followed by frustration. And then we see the final stage of apathy, where people withdraw and disconnect themselves. So here we see the signs of burnout: exhaustion, isolation, escape fantasies, feeling irritable, and frequent illnesses. Now, what's the opposite of this? Well, of course, it starts with that first stage with enthusiasm and excitement and feeling fired up and energized by the work that you do. But how can you have that without moving forward into a stage where you're going to be burned up and burned out? Now, these are concepts that have been studied for many decades. Burnout was first written about back in the 1970s. And it was written about really specifically because they said this is not about the individual not coping well. This concept of burnout is about organizational and system pressures that break down an individual's enjoyment and ability to engage in the work that they do. And the response is to disconnect, to socially isolate. And what do we know from the literature about loneliness and social isolation? I think about some of the research that's been done with older adults. The research is showing right now that loneliness and isolation can be as detrimental to our health as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So the response to burnout, of socially isolating and disconnecting, has a direct physical impact, not only taking people out of the workplace and their otherwise positive engagement with it, but actually impacting their health and well-being. These are really important concepts for us to be paying more attention to. It's not that we didn't pay attention to them before, but I think they just weren't at the forefront. And the final concept that I've come to really become connected to is this idea of moral injury. So moral injury, written about by an American clinical psychiatrist, Dr. Jonathan Shea. And Dr. Shea said that moral injury has 3 main factors: a betrayal of what's right by a person in authority in a high-stakes situation. And when I first heard about this concept, this term of moral injury, I thought, this fits for nursing. It was originally a term coined for veterans of war. And very often we see war analogies being used in healthcare. So I really connected with this term. And yes, every instance of an ethical issue does not cause moral distress, and every instance of an ethical issue does not cause moral injury, but some do. And so this is an interdisciplinary concept involving feelings of intense guilt, sometimes anger, sometimes shame, and a loss of trust in all that was right and good in the world. So this is basically an existential crisis where people's fundamental understanding of the world being a good place and being able to make a positive contribution to the world falls apart. So you can imagine the response of an individual to an experience of moral injury. So a little graphic here, what causes moral injury? Well, moral injuries can occur in a number of ways. It can be an act of commission, so something that you've done or that you've watched somebody else do. It can be an act of omission, so you forgot to do something, it's something you chose not to do and it had an outcome that maybe you didn't anticipate. And it can also be a betrayal. So we see this idea, especially in betrayal of power and authority. being a key component in moral injury. Now, again, what's the opposite? It's important to think about opposites here. Well, the opposite is post-traumatic growth. And so that opportunity to actually be resilient and flourish after a very traumatic experience. So let's talk about this for a minute. Have you heard of this term before? Post-traumatic growth. This is a really beautiful term from positive psychology. If you haven't learned about positive psychology yet, I encourage you to Google it and check it out. It's absolutely incredible research about happiness and flourishing and thriving. And there's a researcher, Dr. George Bonanno. He's an American professor of clinical psychology, and he does really incredible work in the area of resilience and post-traumatic growth. He did a lot of work on 9/11 and learning about people who were able to be resilient after the 9/11 attack. And what he found is that people's ability to be resilient is not the exception to the rule. Resilience is the rule. Human beings are built to be resilient. In fact, to learn from even traumatic experiences and to find meaning and purpose and to be able to find positive outcomes, even after very difficult things have occurred in their lives. And what do people with post-traumatic growth have in common? What does the research say about those individuals? You know, they're not better than anyone else. They're not more special than anyone else. In fact, the reason why they were able to grow from a difficult experience was often because they had social or spiritual supports and networks. So again, this idea of connection is so important. They were also found to have had a role model in their life. They were found to be fairly optimistic people and also to have flexible thought patterns. And they also participated in self-care practices. So these are really important points to think about for yourself in terms of your ability to experience growth after a moral distress experience or a moral injury experience. Now, in my nursing program at Lakehead University School of Nursing, our curriculum and our teaching is based on relational practice. And so we really build on the work of two Canadian nurse researchers, Dr. Colleen Barco and Dr. Gwyneth Joanne. And they talk about relational practice in the context of nursing being about knowing, being, and doing. So three spheres together. So knowing, so paying attention to our moral agency, the choices that we have to make and the power that we hold, about our being and our becoming, so our moral identity, who we are as a person and who we are as a professional nurse, and also the doing aspects of our practice. And so what we do needs to come from a place of compassion. And I talked about compassion as two things, empathy plus action. So empathy plus the desire to act. So if we think about nursing in the context of what we know, who we are, and what we do, what could be some of our strategies in terms of the moral experiences and the moral distress experiences that we're going to come across? So where to start? So I would encourage you three things here: courage, compassion, and connection in your practice. Firstly, courage. I encourage you to be brave, both alone when you're with yourself and also together. So think about who are your people that you can draw together to be brave with you. Compassion, the ability to recognize and respond to suffering, not only other people's suffering. Nurses were really good at responding to other people's suffering, but to respond to our own suffering as well and not to ignore that. And also connection, opportunities to be with other people and have those social support networks, but also to spend some time with ourselves as well. So what does the research say about those three things? Well, the research by Dr. Brene Brown, who's an American social work scholar, says that courage gives us a voice and compassion gives us an ear. And without both, there is no opportunity for empathy and connection. Dr. Brown says, I now see how gifts like courage, compassion, and connection only work when they're exercised every day. So we need to be thinking about these things. We need to be reflecting on them. We need to be taking intentional efforts towards the ethics of our practice every day. And Dr. Brene Brown says, when we're looking for compassion, we need someone who is deeply rooted, is able to bend, and most of all, embrace us for our strengths and our struggles. Where else can we look for some guidance in terms of the ethical issues in our practice and our experiences of moral distress? Well, traditional teachings, if we use the example of teachings from His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, or Joan Halifax, an American Zen Buddhist teacher, they teach this idea of having a strong back and a soft front. So this idea of strong back and soft front is borrowed from a Buddhist teaching. And it says that we don't have to choose between being approachable or authoritative. We need to be like the yin and the yang. We need to have responses that, in fact, complement each other. On a good day, you will lead with one, and then the other will follow easily. So I want you to take this opportunity to think about your own approaches to practice. Do you have a strong back and a soft front? And you're able to use either one depending on what is needed for the moment. I also share with you a really beautiful compassion model developed by Joan Halifax, and she calls this model grace. And so the letters of the word grace highlight the things that it's really important to pay attention to. So in fact, we need to do the small things, the simple things, which are actually quite complex. Things like gathering our attention, being in the present moment. And one way that we can do that is through breath. We need to recall our intention. It's important to remember our purpose. Why are you here? What are your values? It's important to attune first to ourself. We need to take care of ourselves so that we are able to connect with others. We need to consider how we might best serve. We can't do it all. We can't do everything for everyone. We really do need to draw on our experience, our expertise, and our knowledge and think about what would be the best thing to do in this moment. What would be the most helpful thing? Because if we try to do everything, we'll probably end up doing nothing very well. And last but not least, we need to engage and enact. And this is that idea of compassion and connection and letting our principles, our values, our beliefs, our strongly held beliefs guide our practice. And the last point that I will leave with you is this idea of excellence versus perfection. I think in nursing, a lot of times, the profession itself attracts people who like perfection, who strive for perfection. But in fact, as nurses, we should be striving for excellence. And there's a difference between excellence and perfection, because excellence is internally motivated. It's not the world telling us how we need to be. Excellence is about having high standards, not just for ourselves, but also for others around us, and raising the bar on those expectations. It's about being reasonable with accountability and reasonable with our responsibility. We are not responsible for everything, but we do need to be accountable for the things we are responsible for. We need to be unwilling sometimes to accept the status quo. We should not accept it unilaterally all the time. We know that change needs to come and innovation needs to come. We need to be engaging in critical and meaningful reflection, especially on the ethical issues in our practice. And sometimes that can be incredibly painful, but it's important work for us to do. We need to have continuous personal and professional development, always learning, always growing, and we need to catch excellence and we need to throw it to other people, because in fact, excellence is contagious. And we need that in nursing, perhaps now more than we ever did. So this beautiful quote from Dr. Brene Brown, those who have a strong sense of love and belonging have the courage to be imperfect and in fact to seek excellence. So I leave you with this final slide that I hope that I've broadened and caused some depth to your understanding of moral distress and some of the related terms. And in fact, instead of seeking to avoid moral distress, could this be your superpower? So I would like to leave you with these words that we cannot avoid or prevent all experiences of moral distress in healthcare. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't try to avoid or prevent them. Moral distress experiences tell us something about our values and about what is most sacred in our nursing practice. And we need to continually learn, to be lifelong learners as nurses, to learn how to address these experiences, to promote our own health and well-being, and to protect the lives of those that we serve. And by doing so, we are going to be preventing and reducing harm. We are going to be practicing in trauma and violence-informed ways. And this is how we'll develop and find compassion, satisfaction, and in fact, joy in nursing. And if you've been a nurse for a while, maybe to find that joy again. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation here today. I've shared with you some selected publications that you might be interested in, and also some other really great references that I think you might like. So with that, I will stop for questions that you might have. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. Thanks, everyone.
Muito bem. A doutora Kristen, que está conosco nesse momento, presencialmente. I want to thank you, Kristen, to be with us today in this afternoon.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Nós vamos passar agora as perguntas da audiência, as perguntas da plateia. Alguém tem alguma pergunta para fazer? Por favor, usem o chat para a gente passar as perguntas para a Kristen. I just ask to the audience to make questions for you. Just a minute, please.
Sure.
Plateia, alguma pergunta? No one question. No one have. Ninguém tem uma perguntinha? So, let I ask you. Eu gostaria de saber se na sua localidade existem redes de apoio a pessoas com sofrimento moral e que estratégias vocês utilizam nessa localidade para prevenir ou intervir neste problema. Kristen, I would like to know if in your locality there are support networks for people with moral distress, and what strategies do you use to prevent or intervene on this problem?
That's a really great question. So I think the short answer is no. There are not good support networks for moral distress, but I think many people have developed their own responses to help themselves and each other.
Ok, let's translate to the Portuguese. Então, a Kristen falou que eles não têm rede de suporte Como vocês devem ter, foi uma palestra extremamente importante, eu acho que condizente com o momento em que nós estamos ainda passando em relação à pandemia de Covid, não é? Em que, principalmente, o cuidador tem passado por questões de sofrimento moral em relação tanto às questões éticas do trabalho, quanto às questões técnicas que eles têm passado. E aí a Kristen respondeu que eles não têm rede de suporte, tá certo, para dar assistência, e que, na verdade, têm aprendido uns com os outros. Let me ask you another question. Have you identified any increasing rates of moral distress among nurses during the COVID pandemic?
So certainly, I think during the COVID pandemic, moral distress was existing among our nurses, and it became compounded with the experiences such as patients not being able to have their family members in to visit them, shortages for resources, so medications and things like that, and also just needing to work so much under very intense conditions. So yes, I think it was there before, and then it was built upon by the COVID pandemic.
Thank you. It's this. I think it's the same in Brazil. A Kristen respondeu, então, que notou, observou um aumento no índice, né, de sofrimento moral nos profissionais de enfermagem durante a pandemia de Covid-19, né? E relacionados tanto às questões estruturais de equipamento, como também às questões afetivas, sobre o fato dos pacientes estarem afastados de suas famílias, da falta de contato com seus familiares. Muito bem, então eu comecei as perguntas e estou esperando novas perguntas para a nossa convidada. I ask to the audience for another question. Professor Molina, que está presente, gostaria de fazer uma pergunta? Professor, envia pelo chat. Maybe, Kristen, perhaps we come to make a partnership to study more in both countries. I think it's very interesting and learn each other.
That would be wonderful. And I would love to explore some cultural components of coping with moral distress and also ethical practices.
Okay. Nenhuma pergunta, pessoal? Olha lá o que a gente aprendeu hoje de manhã sobre a internacionalização. Essa é uma oportunidade de internacionalizar. Então, aqueles que falam inglês tão ruim quanto eu, sintam-se à vontade para fazer perguntas à professora Kristen. Nada mais? Muito bem. So, I would like, on behalf of the Associate Graduate Program in Nursing, to thank Professor Kristen for sharing with us this very complex topic of ethics in nursing, practice, moral distress, and how to deal with it with concern the excellence. Certainly, her words will echo in many of the minds present here. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you very much. I hope we talk some more about this theme in another
That would be great. Thank you, Dr. Santos.
Thank you. So, we finished this presentation. Nós terminamos, então, a nossa apresentação de hoje à tarde, agradecendo pela presença dos alunos, dos professores, principalmente da professora Kristen, que abrilhantou o nosso evento hoje. Bye, bye, Kristen.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye, bye.